Hi, welcome back to AJS101, Lesson 2, and now we're going to begin Part 2 of the lesson. And we're going to talk about the Uniform Crime Report Part 1 offenses. So let's begin with murder. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being. And there are two degrees of murder. Murder in the first degree is the intentional killing of a human being, whereas murder in the second degree is the intentional killing of a human being in the heat of passion. Now let's take a look at the difference. In both Murder 1 and Murder 2, the actus reus, the prohibited act of killing a human being, are present. In addition, in both Murder 1 and Murder 2, the mens rea, the state of mind, intentional, is also present. However, Murder 2 is not as serious because there is a mitigating factor, and that is in the heat of passion. So in Murder 1, the person intentionally kills somebody else. He or she wants that person dead, and they kill that person in cold blood. Whereas in Murder 2, there's the factor of the heat of passion. The person still intentionally kills that person, but they're very upset over something. For example, the person comes home early from work one night and discovers their spouse in bed with their best friend. They become enraged. They want to kill the best friend, and they intentionally kill the best friend. However, they are in the heat of passion. They're extremely upset because of what they saw. That's a mitigating factor that reduces the punishment, the level of liability. So for Murder 1, you can be executed in some states or given life imprisonment, whereas Murder 2 might be 25, 30 years in prison. Now, most murders are committed by those known to the victim. So usually, if you're going to be murdered, it's somebody who knows you. Stranger murders aren't as frequent. In addition, about 64% of murders are cleared today, versus over 90% in the 1950s. And by cleared, we usually mean somebody gets arrested. The reason for the difference is that there are more stranger murders today. There are more people murdered in drug deals. There are more people murdered in a street robbery, where unless there's a witness or some forensic evidence is left behind, there is no way to connect the murderer to the victim. Whereas in the old days, there were less of these crimes. So there was usually the two victim and perpetrator knew each other, so it was easier to link them. Now let's talk about two different types of murders. The first are serial murders. And serial murders are a series of murders committed over a period of time. Think of like Son of Sam. These are killers who murder people one at a time with time difference between the two. The time difference might be short, might be a day or two, it could be long, it could be a year. But somebody who kills multiple people but at different times is a serial murderer. On the other hand, we have mass murderers. And a mass murderer is somebody who kills a group of people, usually 4 or more, at the same time. So the person walks into a store or a nightclub and begins shooting up the place and killing people. That would be a mass murderer. Now let's also talk about the term homicide, because you'll hear this term mentioned, and some people think that it's the same as murder, and that's not exactly true. Homicide is a generic term for killing another person. It comes from two Latin words, hom, meaning human being, and the suffix side, meaning to kill, like an insecticide kills insects. Well, homicide is the killing of a human being. And it includes the specific crimes of murder, manslaughter, and criminally negligent homicide. I might also mention that homicide also includes the legal killing of people. A person who's executed by the state is legally being killed. A person who is killed by somebody else when they're justified, maybe self-defense. That is also a legal killing, but they're all homicides. So a homicide can be an illegal killing, like murder, manslaughter, or criminally negligent homicide, or it could be the legal taking of a life, like somebody doing it in self-defense. All right, let's talk about rape. Forcible rape is sexual intercourse with a female without her consent, when the lack of consent is due to the actual use or threatened use of force. So to have a forcible rape, you have to have first sexual intercourse, and this can be penetration, however slight. It also has to be without consent, and the lack of consent has to be based upon the threatened use or actual use of force. There can be other types of lack of consent where you would have rape. A person having sex with an unconscious person or a mentally disabled person. These would also be raped because those people aren't consenting, or an underage person. But it's forcible rape when the lack of consent is due to the use or threatened use of force. Now, forcible rape is the least reported of all crimes. And in fact, reasons as few as 16% of all rapes are reported include fear and shame. Fear of retaliation from the rapist later on, or friends or family members of the rapist. And the shame is because rape involves sex, and there's always a certain amount of shame and evolving sex, even non-criminal sex. There's embarrassment and shame. So fear and shame are the main reasons. However, insensitive treatment by police officers is also a factor. When I was first a police officer, we received very little training on how to deal and help rape victims. And the treatment was often insensitive. They would be questioned in front of multiple officers. They would be sitting in an interview room and people would walk by and stare at them. Officers weren't trained in how to psychologically deal and talk to them. So that was always a problem. It's less now because there's more training, and there are also specially trained sex crimes investigators who will interview rape victims. Another reason why reporting is low is the invasive examination needed to retrieve the evidence. To have a successful prosecution, you usually have to prove sexual penetration, and that usually involves a medical exam to check for injuries and possibly semen. And it's a little bit intrusive, and that's kind of embarrassing too. Another thing that sometimes deters rape victims from reporting it or proceeding with prosecution is the possibility of having to reveal one's sexual history in court. Now, when I first became a police officer, it was a common tactic by defense attorneys to question the rape victim about all of her sexual histories, encounters, consensual and not. And this was extremely embarrassing, especially if family members were in the courtroom. Now, however, that's not allowed. In fact, about the only questioning of a victim's prior sexual history might be with the accused rapist, if the allegation is that it was consensual and a common practice. But these factors also contributed to the low reporting rate. Some think as low as 16%. Now, there are also many fallacies surrounding the crime of rape, and these are detailed in your textbook, and you should take a look at them. But these are, issues that seductive dress by the victim, she was asking for it, things like that, which really have been proven false. Now, sexual battery is another sex crime. It's also called sexual abuse. And sexual battery involves the sexual contact with intimate parts of the body without consent. So this is somebody basically, without the consent of the victim, feeling an intimate part, usually the breast or the buttocks or the sex organ area. Okay, and this sometimes happens in public, and it's usually a misdemeanor. Sometimes it's hard to prove. Sometimes people engage in this unlawful touching in crowded areas where they can claim it was an accident. It was very common in the New York City subway system, where in a crowded rush hour car where everybody's standing and the train is lurching about, somebody would pretend to fall and grab and touch a woman's breast or buttocks. It's extremely difficult to prove that that wasn't an accident, but sometimes it is in fact abuse. In fact, in the Tokyo subway system, culturally, there is so much of that going on that they actually, during rush hour, have separate subway cars for females only to avoid exposing them to that type of abuse. Date rape is rape that occurs in the context of a dating relationship. Now, you can certainly be raped by somebody that you're dating. There's no doubt about that. The problem is it often comes down to a he said, she said situation, unless there's a third-party witness or a video or really signs of injury and force. It was forcible rape. So date rape is clearly rape, but it's very difficult to prove. So you really need to be careful who you go out with and who you wind up alone with until you really know somebody. Homosexual rape also occurs, but in most jurisdictions it is covered under separate sodomy statutes. Rape involves penis, vagina penetration wherever slight. Sodomy, on the other hand, involves other parts of the body, which would be penis, anus, penis, mouth, mouth, vagina. So those would be covered under sodomy statutes. Many states have made their rape laws gender neutral so that a female could be convicted of raping a male. This is fairly rare, but in fact it does happen. And usually in the situation where a female charged with raping a male, the more common situation is when it's an adult female who has sex with an underage male. Okay, now let's move on to robbery. Robbery is forcible stealing, and stealing is the unlawful taking of property. So somebody commits robbery when they take somebody's property by the actual use of force or the threatened immediate use of force. Person chain snatchings are not robberies, but larcenies from the person. These person chain snatchings began to become prevalent in the 1980s. In fact, while I was a police officer, chain snatchings were epidemic in New York City, in Manhattan in particular, in the 1980s, where a person, usually a woman, would be walking down the street with a gold chain around her neck, and some guy would walk up, grab the chain, pull it from her neck, and run away. That is technically a larceny from the person. It's automatically a felony larceny because it's from the person, but there's no real force involved. Now, if it were a handbag and it was snatched and the victim didn't let go, and the perpetrator began pulling and dragging the victim from with the handbag holding on to, then you would have a robbery. But if the property is just snatched without any real resistance from the victim, it would be a larceny. Okay, so robbery can be armed or unarmed. And an unarmed robbery is called a strong-arm robbery. Armed robbery, of course, is more serious because a weapon is involved, knife or a gun usually. It could be a stick or a club. Outdoor robberies are called highway robberies. In the old days, Robin Hood and merry old England. Today, though, we call outdoor robberies muggings. And robberies are more prevalent in what areas? What do you think? Do you think they're more prevalent in rural areas or urban areas? Well, obviously, urban areas. There's generally less victims in rural areas, and most people know each other in rural areas, so they can't get away with a robbery where their victim doesn't know them and may never see them again. All right, let's talk about assault. Assault is intentionally causing injury to another, although some states make recklessly causing serious injury to another with a weapon assault. So again, assault is intentionally causing injury to somebody else. Aggravated assault is intentionally causing injury to another with a weapon or intentionally causing serious injury to another. So basically, causing injury is the basic crime. Intentionally causing injury is the basic crime of assault. In some jurisdictions, if you recklessly cause injury with a weapon or a vehicle, you can be charged with assault. And it's more serious aggravated assault if you cause serious injury or if you use a weapon. Now let's talk about burglary. Burglary is unlawfully entering or remaining in a building with intent to commit a crime inside. Burglary is a property crime. So first of all, the traditional burglary we think about is entering a building. But we mention remaining unlawfully for a situation where an individual enters a building lawfully, hides and doesn't come out till after closing to steal stuff. So you sneak into a department store when it's open. You haven't unlawfully entered. You hide under a display. After it's closed, you come out, you steal stuff, and you leave. So that's why we also include entering or remaining unlawfully. And again, you have to have an intent to commit a crime. If somebody broke into a shed because they wanted to sleep, it was cold outside, they did unlawfully enter a building, but they didn't do it to commit a crime. So it would not be burglary. It would be the less serious crime of criminal trespass. Now, if the person also commits the crime they entered to commit, they're also guilty of that crime. So if I enter a store to steal property and I steal that property, I'm going to be guilty of burglary and possession of stolen property and larceny. And if I did damage to get in, also criminal mischief. Aggravating factors for burglary include the type of premise. It is much more serious to burglarize a home, a domicile where people live, than it is a warehouse or a factory. Another aggravating factor is the time. It's more serious to burglarize at night than in the daytime, because obviously things are more scary at night. And it's also more serious a burglary if you are armed with a weapon. Now, most residential burglaries occur, when do you think? In the daytime or at night? Well, most residential home burglaries occur in the daytime. And that's kind of obvious because people aren't home, they're at work. So you want to burglarize when they aren't there. Because at night they would be there and they might wake up and shoot you. Commercial burglaries, on the other hand, occur at night when the establishments are closed and nobody is there. Burglaries also have a very low clearance rate. Only about 14% of burglaries are cleared by an arrest. That is increasing a bit, though, due to the availability of video equipment in homes and DNA evidence. Sometimes the person leaves a little bit of blood breaking a window, or they eat some food and leave some saliva on an apple in the kitchen. And if they're in the DNA database because they were previously in prison, they can be apprehended that way. Now let's talk about larceny. Larceny is the unlawful taking of the property of another, and it also includes failure to return found property and keeping property delivered by mistake. So if you're walking down the street and you suddenly see an envelope and somebody's name is on it and it's got like $100 in it, if you keep that, you've committed a larceny. You're supposed to turn that into the police. In most jurisdictions, they'll take your name, and if nobody claims the property within so many days or months, it'll be given to you. It's also illegal to take property delivered by mistake. So if a TV set meant for your neighbors winds up at your doorstep, you can't keep it. If you order one radio and two show up, you can't keep both. Now, larcenies can be either petit or grand. Petit, minor, is usually a misdemeanor. Grand larcenies are usually felonies. Generally, stealing small amounts of money is petit larceny, or property valued within, say, less than $1,500 in most jurisdictions is petit larceny. $1,500 or more is usually grand larceny. But regardless of the value of the property, if you steal certain types of property, a credit card or a weapon or official government records, that's automatically a felony. The way you steal can also make it a felony grand larceny. If you steal property from the person of another, like picking a pocket, that's automatically grand larceny, even if you only pull out a 59-cent comb. Motor vehicle theft is a popular form of theft, with many vehicles being stolen for their parts. Most vehicles are worth more when they're chopped up and the parts are sold than when they're all together, as anybody who has had to have a part of their vehicle replaced and went to a dealership or repair shop finds out. Arson is the destruction of a building or a vehicle by fire or explosion. Now, there are many reasons why arson, a person might commit arson. Arson is often committed for profit. Sometimes restaurants that are failing, the owners, rather than go bankrupt, because it takes a lot of money to invest into a restaurant, rather than go bankrupt, they'll sneak in at night and they'll start a fire hoping to collect the insurance money. So committed for insurance money. Also, it can be committed for revenge. You might hate somebody. Sometimes these are hate crimes involving race, and you burn down their house or burn their car down. I mentioned insurance money already. Sometimes to destroy evidence. Sometimes somebody will commit a serious crime and burn the crime scene so that there'll be no fingerprints or other evidence, or for other illegal purposes. So arson is an extremely serious crime, much more serious if you torch a residence than a vehicle or an unoccupied building. And let's now move on to the Uniform Crime Report Part 2 offenses. Now, these are generally less serious offenses, and they include the victimless crimes and status offenses. Now, a victimless crime is a crime where there is technically no victim. And I'm talking about drug purchasing, where the buyer is a willing participant in the encounter. I'm talking about prostitution, where the John is a willing participant. These are considered victimless crimes, even though there are victims. People who buy drugs overdose or they mess up their lives. Prostitutes obviously have horrible lives, so they're not living any great life in that lifestyle. People who patronize them sometimes get venereal diseases. So even though they're called victimless crimes because the participants are voluntary, they really are victims. The Part 2 offenses also include the status offenses. And a status offense is when you do an illegal act that would be legal for most people, but because of your status, you can't do it. The most obvious is underage drinking or underage cigarette smoking. Also running away from home. If you're an adult, you can run away and never come back, but you can't if you're a child. And again, the same is true of drinking alcohol and smoking cigarettes. We call those status offenses. Now, while the Part 1 offense statistics in the UCR showed the number of crimes reported, for these Part 2 offenses, they only record the number of arrests made. Only arrests are recorded in Part 2 offenses because most never are known to the police. People don't report that they just bought drugs. Teenagers who drink alcohol don't report that they're drinking alcohol. So because the reporting is very low, we generally, and another reason why is that in the Part 2, in these minor offenses, very often if the arrest numbers are actually driven by the activities of the police. So if the police decide to do a crackdown on prostitutes, you'll have more arrests for prostitutes. So because of all these factors, these are not that accurately recorded, and they don't always, the statistics don't always represent the actual number of these crimes going on. So the only arrest recording is the more accurate way to count them, and even that has its fallacies. So that concludes Lesson 2, Part 2.